Morning, everybody. Hi again. My name is Neil Kalin. I'm going to be hosting today's webinar special Tuesday morning edition of Legal Live webinar. Today, we're going to be focusing on the revisions, so the upcoming and new buyer representation and broker compensation agreement and the many forms that go along with that form. We're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about some of the NAR settlement and the changes that were required by the NAR settlement. And it looks like we've got a number of people already joining us, which is good news to hear. Let me tell you how we're going to be working today because there is so much material to cover. I am going to be talking for the most part of an hour. When the hour is up, I am going to be taking questions from one of the CAR attorneys. We have Justin Murakawa and Jana Gardner, who are in the background, who are reviewing all of your questions. You can submit a question in the Q&A tab. We're not going to be answering questions as they come in because there's just too many of you and not enough of us to be doing that. But we're going to be, the two of them, Jana and Justin, are going to be reviewing those questions and the most common questions they will ask me when we are through with the webinar. Now, even though this is scheduled for 10 to 11, we're going to keep this open until 11:30 so that I can answer as many questions as possible. And I will probably be joined by Justin Murakawa at that point, who will want to give his own take on many of the questions that you are submitted. If by chance there is some leftover time, we will ask you to raise your hands and we'll take some individual questions. But given what happened last week when we did a similar webinar, not too likely that that's going to happen, but we'll do our best. Okay, I think that's good. Your chat is disabled, just so you know that. But if you look at the chat, you will see occasionally Brigitte, who is our presenter. I don't really know your title, administrative assistant, something like that. She's giving me the thumbs up, so that's good. She will be posting from time to time where you can get copies of today's presentation materials. So that's really good. Let's get us started. When you think of, for those of you who attended the webinar last week, material is going to be basically the same. I'm going to give some updates if anything happened different between last week and this week, but for the most part, it's the same material as I presented in last week's webinar, which was a CAR educational webinar. Okay, so hopefully I didn't lose half the audience by saying that today, but let's just move on. Buyer broker agreements. What do you think of when you think of buyer broker agreements? This is the reaction of a lot of our members. Are you kidding me? Sometimes with an expletive put somewhere in the middle of that question mark. So I think what we're going to do today is we're going to change the I can't to I can. And not only can you, as of August 17th, this is something that's going to be a must for you to do, for all realtors to do, not just in California, but also throughout the entire nation. Real quick announcements, what's coming up at CAR and Legal Live webinars. Well, we actually have another one tomorrow, which is for the residential listing agreement and related forms. So if you're interested in hearing about those, please join us tomorrow. You can sign up where it says there, car.org, Risk Management Live. At next week, we're doing one on all of the other new and revised forms, because believe it or not, there's a lot going on besides the settlement and settlement related forms. There are some updates to the residential purchase agreement, to the seller property questionnaire, to a whole list of other forms, and we're going to go over those next week. And then July 9th, we're taking a complete break from forms entirely. We're even taking a little break from the law, and we're have a really great webinar put on by two of the CAR attorneys, Jana Gardner, who's in the background today, and Olivia Van. And they're going to be talking about dealing with abusive clients and agents. So a really fascinating Legal Live webinar next month. We've got a quick guide that came out the end of last month. Be careful what you write and say. It might come back to you someday. And yes, you want to take your time before responding to any matters that have you emotionally driven, where you might say something that you really should not be putting into print, electronic or otherwise. We've got a new Legal Matters podcast. So thank you, Jana and Dana. Episode 21 is out, dealing with mid-year new laws. And then always remember, we have social media here at CAR. We've got some anyway. We have an Instagram account and we have a Twitter account. Perfect. Let's start talking about buyer representation agreements. So here's a screenshot, the AD form. That's the only one that's going to appear first. Then you're going to have your primary document. And then if there's any other bundled forms that are going to come after the primary document. Okay. What else? There's a new exclusive opt-in clause, right? And we're going to talk a lot more about that. There's a new compensation confirmation paragraph. We're going to talk a lot more about that. New forms for buyer preferences and finances. A lot of stuff we're going to be talking about, maximum representation period. But there's a lot of things here that are exactly the same, right? The same default to non-exclusive, the same right to choose exclusive, the same cancellation rights, the same authorizations and obligations, and this new form is going to be compliant with the terms of the NAR settlement of a class action lawsuit. All right, so let's get started onto the substance. Here we go. Here's page 1. We look right there at the title, Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. What does it say? Non-exclusive, unless exclusive is checked. And notice it also says and initialed, right? So our standard forms committee says, well, you know what? Putting a buyer into an exclusive relationship is a significant change from the way business is done right now in California, because pretty much there's very little usage of buyer representation agreements in California. So our forms committee said, you know what? It's not enough that we are defaulting to a non-exclusive relationship. We want to make sure everybody really understands what they're doing when they get into an exclusive relationship. So you see right there in paragraph 1, the default is, what is the buyer granting the broker? A non-exclusive relationship. The reminder, if you want exclusive, you need to check that box in paragraph 2A2. And paragraph 2A2, that right column, it says, not only do you have to check the box to create an exclusive relationship, you also have to initial in paragraph 14. So you can see paragraph 14 here on your screen. It actually appears on the last page of the buyer representation agreement. And it's an explanation about what an exclusive relationship is. And what's one of the key things to an exclusive relationship? Well, the broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period with or without broker involvement. So the buyer thinks, oh, thank you, broker, for all your activity. I'm not going to go to somebody else. Well, guess what? With an exclusive relationship, there would still be compensation owed to the broker named in the buyer representation agreement, right? Is there a cancellation right under exclusive? Yes, there is, but it requires 30-day advance notice before the cancellation becomes effective. So you're going to initial, no problem. We have no problem with exclusive relationships. I happen to know some brokers who will only do buyer representation under an exclusive relationship. They're devoting their time, energy, resources, and maybe some money as well to try to find buyer property that they want to buy or move into, right? So they believe that exclusive is the way to go. We have no problem with exclusive. We just want to make sure everybody understands it. So you would need to check the box in 2A2 and initial the paragraph on the last page of this contract in paragraph 14. What are the other thing that we notice right here on page 1, just the first couple of paragraphs? Well, we see right there below in paragraph 1, there's an asterisk that the maximum representation period is 3 months from the date this agreement is made. There are exceptions for corporate buyers, limited liability companies, and partnerships. But if you're dealing with an individual, the maximum representation period is 3 months. How would you do that? Well, you go to paragraph 2A1. There you define your representation period. You have a beginning date and you have an ending date. Excuse me. In our old buyer representation agreement, there was not an ending date per se. The representation period lasted for a particular number of days. So you had to fill in the number of days that the agreement was valid. Under the new buyer representation agreement, we have a beginning date and we have an ending date. And you have to remember that ending date cannot be more than 3 months from the beginning date, right? So things that you need to take into account. Why is that? Well, there is a new law that we anticipate will come into effect in California in January of next year that will statutorily impose a 3-month maximum representation period. The Standard Forms Committee thought that that was such a good idea, they wanted members to start getting used to that 3-month period right now. All right, so a buyer representation agreement means that a broker could be entitled to compensation if buyer acquires certain property. So what is that property? Well, that's going to be defined in paragraph 2B. 2B is in boy. So we look at B1. What's new in B1? Well, the answer is pretty simple, that the default is that we're talking about a single family residential property, which could include a condominium and a manufactured home. Are there other properties that you can use this BRBC form for? Yes, absolutely. Whether it's multifamily residential, whether it's commercial, whether it's a tenancy in common, simply check a box. If you happen to be entering into using the BRBC and the client is not at all interested in single family residential, maybe you have a client who is buying investment property only and only wants you to search industrial or commercial, or the client wants vacant land because they want to build something on their own, then you would need to opt out of single family residential. That's with the last box in the 4th column in paragraph B1. You want to define a location for where you're going to be searching for properties for your buyer client, and that could either be cities or counties. The old BRBC form included a price range. The price range has been removed. That is going to be identified when we look at paragraph 2C, additional buyer preferences and priorities. And we kept in, though, paragraphs B4 and B5. That is, if you have specific properties only that you're looking for a buyer, as opposed to a more generic topic, well, great. Then you could, if you have those properties and you could fit them in to the lines in B4, then you check the box in B4 and write those properties only in there. Or if you have an attached list, you could do that in B5. Paragraph B6, properties excluded from representation. You know what? There's really not that much new here. Just a reminder, a buyer's entering into a contract with the broker, and it is important that you, as the broker who is entering into this contract, that you advise the buyer that they've got to be careful if they have signed or if they are considering signing multiple representation agreements. They may be responsible for payment to different brokers, right? And so here, B6 refers to paragraph 7. Look at one of the key paragraphs there in B7A. Buyer shall disclose any property for which buyer is obligated to pay another broker. How is one going to know that? Well, as part of this NAR settlement, it is encouraging full transparency and discussion with your buyer clients. So if you're talking with a buyer about a buyer representation agreement, it is incumbent upon you as the broker to have this discussion with the buyer. Have you signed another representation agreement with a different broker? Do you know if that other representation agreement was exclusive or non-exclusive? Can you tell me what was the general parameters of that other agreement, whether exclusive or non-exclusive? Are there other properties that you have seen with a different broker? Those are the kinds of questions that you're going to want to bring out. Hopefully there will be no conflict with you as the agent who is trying to get the buyer to sign a buyer representation agreement. Look at new paragraph 2C. So we're getting away from the definitions of the property to be acquired but we know there's other considerations that buyers have in mind when they're looking for properties. And so you want to, if you want to find out more about what those other considerations are, you're going to have paragraph 2C checked. You're going to bring into the transaction form BIP, buyer identification of preferences and priorities. So let's take a look at that BIP form right now. Notice at the top, there may be multiple of these forms. Why? Because buyers change their mind. Circumstances change. What the buyer thought they could afford, maybe they cannot afford. Maybe what the buyer did not think they could afford, maybe now they can afford because interest rates change or because the buyer comes into some unexpected money. Right? So this form lets the buyer tell you what the buyer is thinking about. So we look at paragraph 3. What is the buyer thinking about? Well, here's their general price range. You're going to find out whether that's realistic or unrealistic. What kind of property does the buyer want? Well, we started off in our BRBC, the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. We said, well, we know we're talking about single family residence as a default, but is this going to be a primary residence, a second home? Is it going to be for income producing purposes? What are the kinds of things the buyer is looking for? Look at paragraph 3D. What kind of features? How many bedrooms do they want? Maybe they want, a bedroom for every member, if it's a family, for every member of the family, plus a couple of other, bedrooms for guests when they come over. Do they have minimum square footage, a maximum square footage? All these kinds of things are items that you as a broker want to know about so you can refine your search to help the buyer find the kind of property that they want to purchase. The good thing about this form, we believe this form as an add-on to the buyer representation agreement, the BRBC, that the information contained in this form does not need to be provided to a seller. It's confidential between the broker and the buyer. So essentially, when we think about the difference between the BRBC, paragraph 2B, and paragraph 2C, which refers to the BIP form, what's the difference? Well, 2B is sort of the trunk. The BRBC is sort of the trunk of the willow tree. And the BIP form that's referenced in 2C, well, that's sort of like the leaves. They kind of flow. They might go back and forth depending on the particular circumstances that the buyer is discovering or is experiencing at a particular point in time. Let's go back to our BRBC, and we're going to go to really the crux of the BRBC, value, compensation. Paragraph 2D deals with compensation. Remember, this is the compensation between the buyer and the broker. So in our new world that's going to happen as soon as the NAR settlement terms become implemented, and the date for that, final date for that implementation is August 17th. Remember, these forms are going to be released before then. They are being released on June 25th. There's going to be two separate worlds. There's going to be the world where the seller's agent defines how much the seller agent is willing to pay the seller, and the buyer's agent defines how much the buyer is willing to pay the buyer's agent. Okay, so we're dealing with two separate compensation worlds. You have to know your worth. In the old regime, who established your worth? Well, basically the listing broker established your worth by publishing in the MLS the amount of compensation that was offered to cooperate with buyers brokers. Well, first of all, the MLS will not be able to be used to offer compensation going forward. That's one. Okay. Two, the seller's broker may not authorize the seller may not authorize the seller's broker to cooperate. Three, the seller may not be willing to pay the buyer's broker, right? So you have to establish your own worth in a transaction. That is one of the purposes of the BRBC. You need to establish your worth. How much would your compensation be if the buyer acquires property that's defined in paragraph 2B, and you define your own value in paragraph 2D1. Okay? You define your own value. You know what? That's scary for a lot of realtors who have not had to do that in the past. And it's scary for a lot of buyers in California who are not used to signing buyer representation agreements. But it's something that is necessitated by the terms of the NAR class action settlement. And it's something you are going to have to become familiar with. So you're going to have to say what you think you're worth and convince your client that you are worth that as well. So I said, a lot of you may find it scary. When we're going through today's webinar, I want you to think of things that you may find a little bit intimidating, a little bit scary, and I want you to look at them differently and think of it as it could actually is favorable. There's so many items in this buyer representation agreement that at first glance may be difficult to approach, but as you explore them more, well, guess what? They're actually beneficial, not just to you as the licensee, but also to the buyer in the transaction, okay? So we've got the situation here. Notice right there at the caption of paragraph 2D, it says there's this form that's attached. It's a brand new form, the Broker Compensation Advisory, Form BCA. So let's take a look at Form BCA. What does this new form do? It's mentioned not just in paragraph 2D, but it's also mentioned in paragraph 3 as one of the pre-checked forms that's going to be bundled with the BRBC. The new Broker Compensation Advisory talks about the way brokers are going to be paid and need to be paid in transactions under the new system. So the old system, remember, I have a milk example. There was a carton of milk that the seller gave the seller's broker. And the seller, in consultation with the seller's broker, decide how much of that milk are we going to pour into the buyer's broker's glass, right? That was the offer of compensation through the MLS. The new system is going to work very differently. There's going to be a seller side compensation and a buyer side compensation. So instead of one carton of milk, we really have two. They might be the same size, but they might be different sizes. Why? Because the seller's broker may value their services one way, and you as a buyer's broker may value your services as another way. So here we're talking about a buyer representation agreement. We look at the BCA form that's going to be attached. Paragraph 1 is all about how sellers address compensation, right? And it's saying that that compensation is negotiable, but you're going to be dealing with the buyer. Why is it important for you to know that? Because if we look at paragraph 1B, still talking about seller compensation, it says, whether the seller individually through their broker offer compensation to a buyer, that is a negotiable item in the transaction, right? And we go down a little bit further, 1B right below 3, an offer of compensation from seller's broker to buyer's broker is optional. So you need to know that, and this form is a good explanation of that. But if we go a little bit further down in the BCA form, paragraphs 2 and 3 talk about how buyer's broker compensation is working, right? And so we want to have a professional relationship. We want to have transparency in the relationship between the buyer and the buyer's broker. And then once the settlement terms become implemented, at the latest by August 17th of this year, there is going to be an effective requirement that if buyers brokers want to be paid, that they're going to need to have a separate agreement with their buyer. Paragraph 3 talks about the 3 different ways the buyer's broker can be paid. So remember, we talked about our milk carton there, our milk carton for the buyer side and our milk carton for the seller side. Well, how is the buyer's broker going to fill up their carton? Well, they're going to fill it up one of 3 ways, and maybe a combination of those 3 ways. Maybe the buyer is going to pay directly. Maybe the buyer does not have the ability to pay directly. So maybe the seller is going to pay. How can the seller pay? Well, there's really 2 ways to do that, right? The buyer can include in their offer to purchase the property, asking the seller to pay this buyer cost, asking the seller to pay the obligation of the buyer to pay their own broker. That's one way. You're working with the buyer. Maybe your buyer finds a property that is not listed. Well, buyer's agent, you can have a compensation agreement directly with the seller that will not conflict with your BRBC that you have with the buyer. So the buyer can pay, or the seller can pay, or 3C, the seller's agent can pay the buyer's agent if the seller's agent was authorized to do so in the residential listing agreement. So 3 potential sources of compensation for the buyer's agent to be paid. It does not have to be A or B or C. It could be a combination of them. All right, so you've got the situation. Buyer may be a little bit confused by this. Well, wait a minute, I'm agreeing to pay you a certain amount in paragraph 2D1, but buyer may ask you, what if you're getting payment from somebody else? Are you going to be getting double compensation? You know, the buyer may be concerned about that, right? So notice, real easy answer to this, paragraph 2D2. Any amount from third parties shall be credited against buyer's obligation to pay the broker, and broker shall not receive any amount in excess of the amount in 2D1. So you can make the buyer feel better. You know what? This is not physics we're talking about, buyer. This is simple, basic math. We're going to be looking at these situations and trying to find out how much can we reduce buyer your out-of-pocket expenses that you may be obligated to pay me. Now, let's say you have the situation where you agree in the BRBC for the buyer to pay you a certain amount, and the amount that the seller's agent or the seller or both agree to pay you does not add up to that full amount, okay? So the third-party payments are less than the buyer compensation obligation. Well, then you need to talk about the situation of, hey, buyer, maybe we need to ask for the seller to pay during the purchase agreement, okay? Maybe we need to use the purchase agreement to ask for the seller to make up for whatever difference there is, okay? How would you do that? Well, what I'm showing you on the screen right now is actually from the residential purchase agreement. Paragraph 3G3, it's an optional paragraph where the seller can agree to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate the buyer's broker. You would do so if you check the box in 3G3. A form will pop up called the SPBB, seller payment to buyer's broker. And in this revised form for June of this year, it's much simpler than the old version of the SPBB. All we talk about, paragraph 1, how much? How much is the buyer asking the seller to pay? You put a dollar or percentage amount right there in paragraph 1A. Okay. Well, what if you put a huge amount there, but the buyer was only obligated to pay a small amount pursuant to the buyer representation agreement? Well, paragraph 1B makes it clear that the amount, excuse me, it's going to be the lesser of whatever you put in 1A, or the amount that the buyer is obligated to pay pursuant to the BRBC. There must be a BRBC for the seller payment of buyer broker to work. Now, are there upsides to asking the seller to pay what the buyer owes their broker under a BRBC? Yeah, a very obvious upside. It reduces the buyer's out-of-pocket expenses. Are there potential downsides to asking the seller to pay what is a buyer contractual obligation? Well, there are some potential downsides. We need to consider those, which is why there needs to be a discussion between buyer's agent and buyer client, right? Maybe making that ask might make the offer uncompetitive. Maybe the seller would just not be willing to respond to an offer in that way. Or maybe the offer would have to be increased to allow the seller to make that payment without harming the seller's bottom line. All of those factors need to be taken into consideration if the buyer is going to ask the seller to help pay the buyer's contractual obligation. So we move a little bit further down our BRBC, and we go to the situation where, the buyer may still be concerned about this, right? You talked about your value, you're establishing your value. We can talk more about that later. You talk about the fact that third-party payments will be credited against any amount that the buyer has agreed to pay in earlier in paragraph 2, right? But what if the buyer says, you know what? I'm just not in an ability. I just don't have the ability. I don't have the funds to be able to pay for my down payment, pay for my closing costs, make sure that I've got enough money saved up for my mortgage payment, my property taxes, and all sorts of other things that I have to pay. I just don't have the source of funds to be able to do that. Well, there's paragraph 2F, which talks about the buyer's financial and personal information. Notice there's not a box that needs to be checked for 2F to apply. Within 5 calendar days from the execution of this agreement, the buyer needs to provide this form BFPI. Okay? If you have the situation where the buyer really either lacks the ability to pay or intends to purchase using a loan product that does not allow a buyer to pay, then within paragraph 2F, one of those boxes are going to have to be checked. Either the buyer intends to purchase using a VA or other loan which may not allow the buyer to pay, or the buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay. Obviously, you need to be concerned with that buyer. You want to be paid for your services in the transaction, but you need to have understanding for your buyer situation. So let's look at potential solutions to what could be a problem here. And we have the buyer financial and personal information form, BFPI, because the buyer just simply may not be aware of sources that could be used to help them in their situation. So the key thing here really is paragraph 3, property financing information. How much down payment does the buyer have? How much deposit do they have? What is the source of these funds? Well, maybe the buyer is only thinking of savings. Maybe the buyer has not thought about the possibility that they might be able to use retire account money for a home purchase, that they might be able to get a gift, that there's assistance programs. Maybe they have an existing property that they could sell that has equity in it. So there's all sorts of additional information. Has the buyer already had a conversation with a lender? If so, great news. Let's get the information about the lender. Let's find out what the buyer's, if the buyer's been pre-qualified, pre-approved, if it's fully underwritten, but maybe there's other types of programs the buyer should look at other than a conventional loan. Maybe a low down payment FHA loan or a no down payment VA loan. So all of these things are so that you can have a discussion with your buyer and figure out what is going to be best for your buyer and work with you as a buyer's agent at the same time. Excuse me. I want to go back for just a second. No. So when we're talking about those options, we looked at those options here in paragraph 2F. It refers you to paragraph 9B. So we went through the BFPI form. What does 9B say? 9B says, if you happen to be in a situation where one of those boxes is checked in 2F, that the representation agreement is now a contingent agreement. And it's contingent upon either seller agreeing in an accepted offer to pay broker or seller's broker agreeing in a separate document to pay the buyer's broker. Okay? If there's not enough money coming from either of those two sources that the buyer's agent is willing to accept, then the broker is not obligated to represent the buyer on a specific property only. Maybe the buyer really wants you to work with them. You could say, listen, buyer, I don't want to hold you up, but I am not going to work for free in a transaction. I have potential liability anytime I work on a transaction. I cannot work if I am not going to be compensated. So you know what? You may have the ability to release the buyer from their obligation under the BRBC for that one property only. But if that property does not work out, you still have a binding BRBC with the buyer for any other property that fits those parameters. All right, so we're talking about this, the buyer-broker agreement. You've talked about all these options with the buyer. The buyer is really still hesitant. They feel like they're drowning. There's so much information here. They're stuck in the mud. What can they do about the situation? Well, I think one of the things you need to explain to your buyers is that instead of having such a big fear, we're going to make it so there really is no fear. Tell the buyer they're not alone. Every professional realtor is going to be requiring a buyer representation agreement. We are having a transparent relationship. You don't want to enter into an agreement with somebody that is not going to be transparent with you about the way compensation works. And you know what, buyer? If all is said is done, look at paragraph 2E. There's a cancellation right. If we've entered into a non-exclusive relationship, you can cancel at any time. If we enter into an exclusive relationship, you also have the right to cancel, but you have to give us 30 days notice. So buyer, don't feel trapped. There's a way out. Let's see what we can do to work out our agreement together. Maybe one of the things you work out with your buyer is you don't have to have a 3-month representation agreement. Maybe you start with a shorter period of time and see what happens. So how did the cancellation work? Well, very simple. CAR has a form for that, the cancellation of buyer representation. Now, if a buyer cancels and you have already provided services to that buyer, you've already been involved with the property for a buyer, then you have to give that buyer a list of those properties within 5 days of a cancellation. That protects your right to compensation if in fact the buyer purchases those properties during what would have been the representation period. And the cancellation form talks about that as well, that the buyer cannot use your services and then say, okay, thank you very much, I'm now canceling. Again, if there was broker involvement, which we will see shortly, you would still be entitled to compensation. And earlier on, there was a reference to exclusive versus non-exclusive. It referred to paragraph 4B in the BRBC form. So 4B talks about when is compensation earned. Compensation is earned when there is under an exclusive, when there has been broker involvement. And what is broker involvement? It can be one of 5 things, but the big ones are the buyer physically entered and was shown the property by you. The buyer was shown the property virtually by you. You did not just send them a link, you showed them the property virtually. The buyer submitted to seller a signed written offer from the buyer to acquire the property. And there's some other items as well. So if you had broker involvement, that establishes, that triggers your right to be compensated in the transaction. What else do we want to look at here? If it's exclusive, remember, if it's exclusive, there does not have to be broker involvement. That's one of the big differences between exclusive and non-exclusive. And we saw those differences before. Exclusive requires a 30-day notice to cancel, but exclusive says you are entitled to compensation if the buyer acquires property that fits the parameters of paragraph 2B during the term of the representation period. Okay. Are we going to know about those differences? Make sure the buyer understands those differences? Absolutely. That's why for exclusive, there requires not just initials in paragraph 2, not just checking a box in paragraph 2, but also initials in paragraph 14. I talked about giving the buyer a notice of broker involved property. Let's say the buyer does not cancel, but the term of your representation period is about to expire and you had involvement with the property that you think the buyer may be subsequently interested in, right? If you have what's called a protection period or a safety clause, it was on the previous screen. I'm going to go back just for a moment, okay? paragraph 4C that says, oh, if the buyer buys certain properties within a certain period of time after the expiration of the agreement, you are still entitled to compensation, but only if you gave them a notice of those broker-involved properties. You can do that very easily through the notice of broker-involved properties. Actually, this form is being updated. You see on the screen the 12/22 version. There's going to be a June 24 version. All right, so what else do we need to know? What's kind of important for you to know as an agent who's working with buyer on transactions? Well, we look at paragraph 4E. You need to submit the agreement to escrow, telling escrow how much you're going to be paid. What is that agreement going to be? Primarily, it's going to be the buyer representation agreement. It might be form SPBB, so that they know to credit a certain amount that the seller is going to pay. It might also be form CBC, okay, which is a cooperative broker compensation agreement that we're going to get to shortly, okay? But it's up to you to provide the documents to escrow so that they know to pay you. If you're a licensee, if your brokerage also represents the seller, you're essentially treated as two different entities in a way for that purpose, for the purpose of compensation. And you are allowed to get compensation from both sides. Look at paragraph 4H. The buyer may be concerned, right? The buyer may want to know, is there going to be some kind of credit given to them? So that's paragraph 4H. You're going to disclose to the buyer how you anticipate getting paid in the transaction. Okay. How could you do that? CAR form ABCD, anticipated broker compensation disclosure. Now, under the old regime, when you could look in the MLS and see what that anticipated payment would be, it was easy. You could have just given an MLS printout to your client. Under the new method of doing business, you may not know immediately. You may not know until the time the offer is being presented, and you're going to identify what is the compensation you're being offered, whether from the seller, what you hope to get from the seller, or what you hope to get from the seller's agent. And you're going to identify those sources in form A, B, C, D. So the buyer can evaluate, does this purchase make sense for the buyer? Will the buyer have to come out of pocket to pay you on any specific transaction? All right, so you have the situation where I said there's no longer going to be an offer of compensation offered through the MLS. How is the buyer's agent going to know if the seller's agent has been authorized to cooperate with the buyer's agent? Well, form CBC, cooperating broker compensation agreement, right? You identify the parties, the broker, seller's brokerage firm, buyer's brokerage firm. Paragraph 3, what is the offer of compensation? This, under the old CBC, was a 2-page form. The new CBC is only a 1-page form. Why? Because we're able to remove a lot of paragraphs. The confirmation or modification of the MLS offer. There is no longer an MLS offer, right? It does not matter if the agents are MLS participants or not participants, if the property is listed in the MLS or not listed. All those paragraphs we're able to remove. We removed the paragraph regarding management approval. Why? Because information about the buyer's broker and the seller's broker figuring out whether there's going to be offer of compensation may come right up to the point of whether the buyer's making an offer. And our standard forms committee says, we don't want to have that process interfere with the buyer and seller entering into agreement. So we don't want to have this extra step involved requiring management approval. The old CBC rarely used in California. Why? Because most agents relied on the MLS. The new CBC we anticipate will almost always be needed if the buyer's broker is going to be receiving compensation from the seller's broker. What else do I want to mention here? Notice paragraph 3, something brand new just for you listeners today, something I think you'd like to know about. So paragraph 3, the offer regarding compensation, the first part, identifying the amount or the percentage, that's easy, but look at the second sentence. This agreement, the CBC, is contingent upon buyer and seller entering into a purchase agreement and buyer's broker being confirmed as the agent of the buyer. Where would that confirmation be? In the broker paragraph on the last page of the RPA and in the agency disclosure paragraph at the beginning of the RPA. And two, that the purchase actually close escrow, right? So there are some considerations there. We're also looking at adding a line to paragraph 5 that will identify when the CBC needs to be provided. We know that there are different methods throughout the state of how people are anticipating this process to go. Some anticipate that if the seller authorizes the listing broker to make an offer of compensation, that that might be provided up front, and the CBC signed by the seller's agent might be provided up front. Well, do you want that offer to stay out there forever, or will it have to be returned to the seller's agent at a certain point in time? And that is something that we are probably going to be modifying paragraph 5 to address as well. All right, so the rest of these paragraphs, not going to spend a lot of time on, just to remind you, paragraph 7 of the BRBC, talked about this at the beginning. Have an honest, open discussion with your client. Have they had another agreement with a different broker? Was it exclusive or non-exclusive? What was the parameters? What was the property to be described and the locations, right? Paragraph 8, great paragraph that I'm not going to go into, but it really describes your worth. You have a lot of licensees out there who do not know how to establish the value they bring to a buyer in a transaction. Paragraph 8 lists all of these things you do: conducting a visual inspection, helping the buyer find inspectors, giving the buyer referrals to lenders, giving the buyers referrals to people who can help them during the transaction, delivering communications, being the intermediary between the client and escrow, or between the client and the seller side of the transaction. There's a lot you do, a lot that's listed here. Make sure you do not forget to establish your value in the transaction. Now, we talked before about that form BFPI. Let's say the buyer gives you the BFPI within 5 days after the agreement has been entered into, and you find that the buyer is wholly unqualified for the type of property that you've identified in paragraph 2 of the BRBC. Well, 9B gives you the right to be able to get out of the transaction. The issue is, do you really want to get out of the transaction? Or is it better for you to work with the buyer and maybe modify the terms of the transaction? Or is it better for you to modify the terms of the transaction so that you can have an agreement that is going to work for both you and the buyer? The other item I want to point out on this page is paragraph 11, management approval. Just like the listing agreement allows the broker or office manager to cancel a listing agreement within 5 days of its execution, the same holds true for the new buyer representation agreement. We talked about paragraph 14. Paragraph 16 is a new paragraph, confirmation of compensation. So let's say the seller agrees to pay pursuant to the purchase agreement. Paragraph 3, G3 of the purchase agreement. Form SPBB is attached. The seller may want to make sure that the buyer is actually contractually obligated to pay. So the buyer, just like in the old form, the new form says, buyer, the seller has the right to ask whether you actually have that obligation. Under the old BRBC, it's kind of hard. You have to pick out certain paragraphs. Under the new BRBC for June of this year, that's going to be released June of this year, you can simply provide the last page. Paragraph 16 will autofill the same information. from the compensation paragraph in 2, and it will have the buyer's signature on this page, so the seller will know that the buyer does in fact have a contractual obligation. So let's go through a few what ifs, and then I'm going to open it up. We're going to try to answer questions for another half hour. What if you already have a BRBC, so you use the old version, it has not expired, and the buyer has not bought a property before 1/1 of 25, or what happens 1/1 of 25? We anticipate a 3-month maximum date, or the commission has been removed from the MLS. Well, what could you do if you had an old BRBC and you were still expecting to be paid through the MLS offer of compensation? You're probably going to have some kind of modification to your old BRBC, right? So there's a couple of things you could do. You got to either cancel the old BRBC and replace it with a new BRBC, or at the very least, you'd want to give the buyer this disclosure and modification, notifying the buyer there's no longer, as of, right, August of this year, mid-August of this year, there's no longer to be an offer through the MLS. So at the very least, you're going to want to do a disclosure and modification prior to August of this year. But maybe you just replace the whole thing if you have a good working relationship with your buyer client. All right, what if you need to modify or extend? Let's say you're using the new BRBC, right? And maybe you started off with a very short time period because the buyer was concerned about being trapped in a relationship that may not work. So you did not do a 3-month BRBC. Maybe you did 2 days or 3 days or a week or a month or whatever it was, right? And now your relationship is really working, but you need to extend that because the buyer's not yet bought a property. What do? Well, you use the modification of terms, buyer representation agreement, new form MTBR, pre-printed language to either extend the expiration date or maybe change the compensation if that is what is needed. Notice management approval for this modification as well, because you're really changing the buyer representation agreement. All right, let's deal with our next what if. What if the potential buyer, you've gone through all these things, you've talked about the third-party payments, you've talked about maybe having a short period of time, you talked about maybe narrowing the scope of the property to be acquired, you did all of these things, the buyer is still hesitant to work for you. Is there something else that you could do? Yes, CAR is coming out with a new form, limited property representation and broker compensation agreement, LPRBC. LPRBC, what about LPRBC? Well, it's only going to be good for up to 3 properties that you are going to be showing the buyer. Maybe there's an open house for those properties, or you're going to be doing a virtual tour of those properties for the buyer. It is non-exclusive only, and it has a representation period that the maximum period of time is only 30 days. So I like to consider this like the baby brother or the baby sister, the younger brother or the younger sister to the full BRBC. It could get your foot in the door with the buyer, and maybe it is not so intimidating, but you need to be aware. It is only good for up to 3 properties. If you're using this with a buyer, you would check paragraph 1B. You're going to identify the first property up at the top of the page, and you can identify only up to 2 more properties in paragraph 1B3. So very narrow in scope, narrow in terms of representation, non-exclusive only, and it could be whatever time you want, but no more than 30 days. So this may be a good option for you for a buyer that is not prepared to go with the full BRBC. This is a 2-page form. Not going to go into all those other pages right now. Do you want more information? We have a great site on the car.org, on the CAR website, in the risk management page, which is our legal page, car.org/risk management/broker compliance. It talks about where you can find the training, talks about where you can find drafts of all these forms we're talking about, great sound bites. We've got print sound bites. We're coming out really soon with video sound bites that can help you either in office meetings or help you explain things to a client, and all sorts of additional resources as well. Oh my goodness, 1 minute before 11 o'clock. That's it for my prepared remarks. I see Jana's smiling face on the screen. So Jana, I've been so busy, I haven't been paying any attention to whether we've had any questions come in. So have we, and are there any that are in common that you would like me to address?
Yeah, we've had one or two questions come in, quite a few
Okay.
come in. I will say a lot of the questions that were asked, you then subsequently answered in your presentation, so that was great. But there are a handful that were common enough that I think it'd be a good idea to address them. First thing, just I want to give you an opportunity to maybe promote the next webinar we're going to be having, because there were a handful of questions about, well, what if you're the listing agent? What should you do at an open house? Things like that. Where could people learn more about that?
Oh, well, perfect. Yeah. So tomorrow, same time, same station, tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'm going to be putting on a presentation, and I'm probably going to have a little more assistance tomorrow with Justin Murakawa, who may be somewhere back there still on today's webinar. We're going to be talking about the residential listing agreement and the related forms, which include forms dealing with the open house. We're probably going to have a little more of a discussion about that last form I mentioned, the limited property representation agreement. And we're going to talk about the new way compensation is going to work between seller and listing agents. So that's tomorrow from 10 to 11. We're going to do the same thing, mostly talking between 10 and 11, and then having questions from 11 to 11:30. You
Right.
can register by going to car.org/risk management/live. I see it right up there in the chat. So if you didn't get that, look in the chat. You can sign up for that for tomorrow morning's meeting. All right, Jana.
All right, so on a related issue, we got quite a few questions about dual agency. So sort of two-part question. One, is anything changing about dual agency? And two, will an agent who is acting as a dual agent in the transaction have to follow all these same rules and fill out these same forms if they're working with both a seller and a buyer?
Great. So first of all, the law of agency has not changed in California. Dual agency is a viable, allowable, legal status in California. So dual agency is going to be permitted going forward. That has not changed at all. How will one know if one is going to be a dual agent in the transaction? Well, at the time you start working with the buyer, you're not going to know, right? You're not going to know what property the buyer is interested in. You're going to establish your value on the buyer side of the transaction. If it turns out the buyer is interested in and makes an offer on property that is listed by a licensee in your same brokerage company, then there's going to be a dual agency because you've already told the buyer, I am representing you. If the property was listed, what has the agent on behalf of the brokerage already told the seller? That they're going to be representing the seller, right? The agency forms tell you that there may be, right, a dual agency in the transaction. And that's how that would work in this situation. So there would still be compensation theoretically coming from the buyer. There would still be compensation going from the seller to the broker, right? Just dealing with the seller side of the transaction. And as a result of that, since it's the same brokerage company, the brokerage company under these two different agreements would be entitled to compensation under each, but it's not going to change the way that 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 it works for the buyer side in terms of whether there's going to be a credit, because the seller does not know at the time the seller enters into a listing agreement where the buyer is going to come from the seller's property. So the seller may have authorized the listing agent to offer compensation to a buyer side that would still apply even if the buyer side and the seller side are in the same brokerage company. There's one issue that we will talk about tomorrow, which is we know sometimes in the field, if it's the same person who is working with both the buyer and the seller, there may be a little bit of difference of a compensation arrangement. But we're going to talk about that tomorrow because that really affects more on the buyer side, excuse me, the seller side than on the buyer side.
Right. So just to
This-
confirm, I think this is where people were getting a little turned around. Being a dual agent is not like an exception to having to have a buyer representation agreement and all that. If you're representing a buyer, even if you're representing both, the compensation structure is what it is, but you still have to make sure you're dealing with all the appropriate agency forms.
You do have to make sure you're dealing with the appropriate agency forms. And again, I kind of look at it this way, Jenna, that at the time somebody takes a listing, they don't know where the buyer's coming from. So they do not know if there's going to be a dual agency or a single agency in a transaction. At the time somebody starts working with a buyer, they do not know what property the buyer is ultimately going to make an offer on and hopefully buy. So they do not know if there's going to be a dual agency or a single agency in the transaction.
Mhm.
So you just have to treat each situation in its own merits at the time you are entering into these agreements. And if
Mhm.
it turns out there's a dual agency, that does not change the obligations.
Perfect. All right, great. Okay, so another really common question was about the use of the BIPP and the BFPI forms.
Okay.
Basically sort of for both of them, are they optional versus mandatory? And then for both of them, but especially the BIPP, there was a lot of concern about if the buyer ends up buying something outside the scope of the BIPP and how does that affect the right to earn compensation under the agreement?
Okay, great question. So let me try and clarify that. I'm going to start with the BIPP, which is the preferences and priorities form. And the way our buyer representation agreement works, for that form to be brought into the transaction, the box needs to be checked. So it's not an automatic form to be included in the buyer representation relationship. The buyer representation relationship and the trigger for the right to the broker to earn compensation is based upon the parameters that are set out in paragraph 2B. Okay, not 2C, not the BIPP form, but 2B. So we are going to identify a property type. The default is single family residence, right? You identify a location for the property, either county or cities. So there is no other terms that establish the basic parameters of whether the buyer's broker is going to be entitled to compensation. There is an other terms paragraph there. You could put more terms into the body of the BRBC if you like. Okay? But I'm going to make the assumption, I think in most transactions, that BIPP form will be brought into the transaction. Why? Because the broker wants to know, how can I help my buyer get into a property, right? So the initial parameters, that broad base, that trunk of the tree is pretty broad. Single family residence, let's say I put a city, let's say I put a county down. Does that mean any price range, any size, any number of bedrooms, pool, no pool, spa, no spa, in an HOA, not in an HOA, right? Pretty broad for that initial definition of whether the broker has satisfied their obligation to trigger a right to compensation. The BIPP form helps the broker refine the search, right? If the buyer really is interested in a price range from 500,000 to 900,000, there's no sense in the broker searching for $2 million properties in that same city or county, even if they are single family residences. If the buyer is looking for essentially a starter home, right? That's maybe on the smaller size, then you don't need to be looking for, a home with 10 bedrooms and 12 bathrooms, right? So the BIPP is to help you figure out what's the best way to find the right type of properties to your buyer. And that may change over time as you are working with the buyer. The financial and personal information form, BFPI, the way the buyer representation form works is that form is a required form in the transaction. It can be delivered up to 5 days after the representation agreement has been entered into. But the reason why we make that form a required form is that the broker needs to know if the buyer has the realistic ability to buy the property and pay the compensation that is promised in the buyer representation agreement. And if there is no realistic possibility to do that, then the broker, after receiving the BFPI form, needs to make a decision whether to continue working with that buyer with the understanding that there may not be the ability to get paid without some other source of payment, okay? Or that the buyer's expectations are unrealistic and the broker needs to modify those expectations by working with the buyer so that the broker can find appropriate property that fits within the buyer's financial parameters. Okay. Did I cover that, Jen? I'm not quite sure.
Yes, yeah, I think you did. Especially good clarification on sort of the difference between those two forms and how they should be used. So that was helpful. All right. So kind of a broader question. I think you mentioned this at the beginning, but it came up a lot. A lot of questions about the sort of scope of these new rules and when the BRBC form is going to be used. So basically, you know, what if someone just does commercial or vacant lands or leases? Can you talk a little bit about the differences for, you know, the scope of the application here?
Absolutely. So first of all, CAR has had buyer representation agreements for probably 20 years. CAR has always thought it was a good idea for brokers working with buyers to document that relationship in writing. We understand that since most brokers received compensation through the offer that was made through the MLS, that for most licensees working in California, they just did not feel a compelling need to have a buyer representation agreement. Our previous versions, we had 3. We had a buyer broker agreement exclusive, a buyer broker agreement non-exclusive, and a buyer broker agreement that was non-exclusive and not for compensation. A few years ago, all 3 of those were replaced by one form, the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. Now, as a result of some class action lawsuits that were brought against the National Association of Realtors, some large brokerage firms, and some MLSs, one of which went to judgment, and there was a judgment against NAR and the other defendants. That case has a settlement that is in place. Pursuant to the settlement that NAR entered into on behalf of NAR, MLSs, and most licensees throughout the United States, a couple of things are being required pursuant to that settlement. Okay. One is that a licensee working with a buyer needs to have an agreement with that buyer prior to showing a buyer property, either in person or virtually. So essentially mandating buyer representation agreements. That is one of the key terms of the nationwide NAR settlement. Another key term to the nationwide NAR settlement is that the MLS can no longer be used to offer compensation from the listing brokers to the buyer's brokers. So when we combine those two things, how is a buyer's broker going to know whether they're going to be compensated for working on a particular transaction? If there's no unilateral offer made through the MLS, then there's going to have to be some other type of agreement. Well, we know that in order to be showing property under the terms of the settlement, you're going to need to have a buyer representation agreement. Since you as a buyer side agent cannot be sure that there's going to be compensation coming from the seller or the seller's agent, The only way for you to have confidence in the ability to be paid for your services is to use a buyer representation agreement that establishes the right to compensation. The terms of the NAR settlement state that they will be implemented at the latest by August 17th of this year. Now, some MLSs may remove the offer of compensation prior to that, depending on their own technological capabilities, right? So the CAR forms are coming out in June. We know at the latest, there's going to be a requirement to be using buyer representation agreements at the latest by mid-August, but possibly earlier, depending on the MLS in your area. So we believe you should start using buyer representation agreements now. You should start preparing for how you are going to have a buyer representation presentation. Almost everybody on this phone call, I imagine, has a listing presentation, one that they prepare, one that they revise, one that they believe helps them obtain listings on properties. Well, you've got to think of working with buyers in the same way. Use the buyer representation agreement sort of as a instruction manual. Here are some of the issues that you're going to go through. Now, different licensees will be emphasizing different points. Different licensees will be establishing their value in different ways. Different licensees will have different arrangements with their buyers. All of that's fine. Presentations can all differ, but you need to expect that you're going to have to start using these types of agreements. And if a bill that is currently going through the California legislature gets signed, as CAR fully expects it will, then not only will buyer representation agreements be a requirement for realtors pursuant to the NAR settlement, they're going to be a requirement for all licensees in California. One last thing, Jenna, which is that NAR settlement applies to residential sales, meaning residential property with 1 to 4 units. Okay, so the settlement itself does not impact commercial transactions or vacant land transactions or industrial transactions or even lease transactions. But the reality is, once the MLSs remove the offer of compensation, what you may have been used to coming from the MLS is going to be gone. I really don't think MLSs are going to be able to have no offer of compensation field for residential properties and also have a offer of compensation field for the other properties. So you can expect that that compensation will be gone regardless of the type of property, which means you need to be establishing your value for all types of buyers, no matter what kind of property that they are interested in acquiring. Did that address your question?
Yes, very much so. Thank you. All right, so handful of questions about the 3-month limit on the buyer representation period. The sort of biggest one being, you talked about extending, using that MT form to extend if you have an initially short period. But what if you have, you take an agreement for 3 months and it's coming up on expiring and you and the buyer want to continue to work together? Can you use that MT form to extend for, say, another 3 months on top of that?
Absolutely. And I think you need to be aware, I think our listeners need to be aware that any extension cannot exceed 3 months as well. And something I did not cover in my initial conversation, but we have contractual language in the CAR buyer representation agreement that says if you exceed 3 months, then the agreement is invalid, right? So, let's say you're really bad at counting, and today is June 4th, so you can go to July, to August, to September, right? You can go up to September 3rd. Well, let's say you put down September 23rd. You take, if the form was available today and you take the listing, it's now more than 3 months. That entire agreement is invalid. So you've got to be careful about your initial length of time. When you approach the end of the representation period, however long or short it is, it does not matter. You have the ability to extend. Another good opportunity. Remember I talked about thinking of things that are scary and then turning them around? Well, think of this as an opportunity to have a discussion with your client. Things are going well. Let's continue our discussion. Let's continue working together, right? Let me show you what I've been doing for you over the last week or month or 3 months, whatever it is, right? Use that as an opportunity to engage with your client, to establish your value with your client, and then make the ask. Make the ask for an extension. And it could either be for the same period of time or it could be for a different period of time, depending on how the relationship is going between you and the buyer client. Okay.
Perfect. Okay, great. And then this is a pretty straightforward question, that I'm not even sure if you're gonna be able to answer off the top of your head, but maybe you will, you know everything. A lot of people wanted to know, like, which forms are going to be bundled with the BRBC? Like, what's that package going to look like? And I know, I don't know if that's even settled yet or not.
Yeah, it's for the most part settled. And I hope I remember correctly. And if not, if Justin's around, maybe he'll chime in. So the first form is going to be the AD form, the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. Then there's going to be the buyer representation form. Then there's going to be the broker compensation advisory. Then we have what's called the PRBS, the possible representation of more than one buyer and seller. And I don't remember if there's something else. If there is, and if you're listening, Justin, pipe in. But at the very least, we're going to have those 4 forms as part of the bundle.
Okay, excellent.
Oh,
Thank you.
we might also have the California Consumer Privacy Act, because this is establishing a relationship, and we think that that form is likely going to be required at that stage as well.
All right. Okay, and then just a couple more here in our last few minutes. There were a lot of questions about the sort of requirement, or wanting to confirm that it is a requirement to, if you're going to use the RPA, if you're going to utilize paragraph 3G3 and the seller payment to buyer's broker. People just wanted to confirm that you have to provide the BRBC along with that, or a portion of it. Can you just sort of clarify what that process is?
Yep, I will, but first I see, thank you, Justin, for putting a note there in the chat that I could see, which is there's also the possibility that the buyer inspection advisory buyer investigation advisory will also be part of the buyer representation package. So thank you, Justin. And what about paragraph 3G3? Well, right, so here we have the situation. And when we are drafting these forms, we're looking at the situation where a seller may tell the seller may be thinking, well, the buyer is asking me to pay something that the buyer otherwise has an obligation to do. So in the residential purchase agreement, that's paragraph 3G3. 3G1 has been in place effectively for years in the purchase agreement, where the buyer asks the seller to pay the buyer's closing costs. Why? Those are costs that the buyer is obligated to pay in the transaction. 3G3 is asking for a different cost that the buyer is obligated to pay. The cost in the case of 3G3 is the cost of paying their own broker. So when our forms committee was looking at the relationship between what the seller is agreeing to do, the seller may say to himself, well, I only want to pay for something if there is already an existing obligation. I don't want to pay if there's no existing obligation. What incentive do I as a seller have to pay somebody if there is not already an obligation to pay? So that is why we drafted our 3G3 through the seller payment to buyer's broker, SPBB, to say the seller is obligated to pay no more than what is specified in that form, or what the buyer contractually owes their own broker. Well, that means there has to be some kind of contractual obligation, because that's what the seller is agreeing to pay. I'm agreeing to pay buyer what you already owe. If you don't owe anything, then there's no reason for me to have to pay that. Now, Might that change over time? Maybe it would, but that's the way we are looking at transactions now. The seller is agreeing to pay what the buyer has already agreed. If the buyer has no agreement, then the seller is not committed to making that payment. That's why we say you need a BRBC. Okay?
Great. And yeah, and just to clarify, because there were some questions about this too, just to clarify that the whole reasoning that there is that set amount, and then you're showing the amount that's obligated to be paid, that comes from the terms of the NAR settlement, right? About the limitation on the buyer's agent earning from any source an amount that's put into the buyer representation agreement. We had a lot of questions about, excess payments and where do they go and why and all of that. But that's an NAR settlement requirement, just to clarify, right?
Yes, as part of the terms of the NAR settlement, a buyer cannot be obligated to pay more than, or excuse me, the buyer's broker cannot receive more than what the buyer is obligated to pay, right? So if some people may have noticed in our buyer representation agreement, there's the possibility of amending the buyer representation agreement. That amendment would really need to take place prior to a seller committing to something. Because if that amendment happened later, that's after the seller already agreed pursuant to the purchase agreement. So there is the possibility of that amendment. That's something that brokerage companies and buyers are going to have a discussion about. I think brokerage companies have to be cautious about saying, well, I'll just amend the agreement with my buyer at a later point in time. And brokers need to be cautious about that because the buyer may not feel the need to amend. The buyer may say, we had an agreement on day one when we signed the buyer representation agreement. We established on a certain amount or a certain percentage. I've upheld my part of the bargain. Broker, the buyer saying this, I expect you to uphold your part of the bargain as well. Don't expect me to make a change. This is what we agreed on. Okay, so while there's the possibility of having an amendment, I would be worried if I was relying on getting an amendment later on in the transaction.
Right. All right, and then this may or may not be the last question we have time for. We're in our last couple of minutes here, and it's a little bit open-ended, but it came up a lot. Many questions basically asking, what happens if a buyer signs multiple BRBC forms, or what could happen if the buyer is just running around signing multiple buyer representation forms, and how do you know if they're doing that, and what are the situations that could result from it, I suppose.
Great. Okay, good question, right? So really, is it any different than a seller who signs multiple listing agreements, right? The principal is potentially being exposed to having a contractual obligation to pay multiple brokers. That is the biggest risk. Now, the question is, how is one going to know, right? So CAR has those clauses in our buyer representation agreement where the broker needs to ask that question of the buyer client. Okay, buyer, have you signed another agreement with another company? Do you know if that agreement was exclusive or not exclusive? Can you tell me the parameters of that agreement? Is it single family only, or is it other properties as well? Is it investment only? Is it, commercial? Is it industrial only? What is the scope of the parameters? What cities does it cover? Now, maybe the buyer says, you know what? I think I signed something and I just don't remember. Then you could, as part of your discussion with the buyer, you could say, you know what, buyer, do you have a copy? Can you show me a copy? I have heard of some brokers out there, when they work with a buyer and they get a buyer to sign, they ask the buyer to take a picture on their phone, to do a snap on their phone of at least, the first page, right? So that they know what the parameters are of that buyer representation agreement. And if need be, they could show either to the listing company, if it's a different brokerage company, or maybe to another buyer, another brokerage company that is working on a relationship with the buyer, right? So that the client is not put into the position of potentially having multiple obligations to different brokerage companies. Again, with the CAR form, if the form is non-exclusive, is simply having a form establishing the right to compensation? No, there must also be broker involvement with the property that the buyer purchases. We've learned earlier today, what is broker involvement? The three key parts of broker involvement are showing the property, either virtually or in person, or writing an offer for a buyer for the property. There's some other ones as well in that paragraph, but those are the three primary ways where I think a broker is going to be able to establish their right to compensation. Could a buyer have that relationship with more than one brokerage company? Yes, it's possible, but it's something we want to avoid also, if at all possible.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we're right at 11:30. So do we want to thank everybody and wrap it up?
Well, very good. We'll do that. I could do that. So, I just opened up my Q&A. I see there are a lot of questions. A lot of them haven't been answered. Couple of things I would just want to remind everybody of. One, we have our broker compliance page on car.org. So somebody maybe Brigitte will post that in the chat just for a moment, where people remind people where they can get to the broker compliance page. Second, we have a lot of educational information. Third, if you have questions, you may want to, of course, talk to your broker, your office manager, or call the CAR legal hotline to try to get a question answered. Remember, tomorrow morning from 10 to 11, we have another one discussing the residential listing agreement. Thank you for bearing with us. There is so much. I'm sure we're going to have a lot more information forthcoming. Jana, as long as your face is still showing, anything you want to say before we close this webinar?
No, I think we've covered an awful lot. I hope people can join us tomorrow for information about the listing side. And like you said, just reminding everybody, if they can't or they want to revisit this, to go to the Legal Live page to revisit it. And I'll just also remind people that the number for the legal hotline is 213-739-8282. That's 213-739-8282 if you want to call and talk any of this over with a hotline attorney.
Thank you, everybody. We appreciate you spending time with us this morning. We hope to see you in the future.